It was the most dangerous sound in ancient Rome. The safety of the most powerful empire on earth hinged on a fire that could never go out. Imagine the weight of a civilization resting on the shoulders of a 6-year-old girl. They were untouchable, revered, and one misstep away from being buried alive. Rome gave them supreme power, then demanded they sacrifice everything to keep it. The air in ancient Rome was thick with ambition, marble dust, and the constant nagging fear of divine displeasure. In a city where legions conquered continents and senators plotted murder, stability was a fleeting dream, secured only by an impossible vow. We begin at the beating heart of that anxiety, the Temple of Vesta. Step closer to the Roman Forum, not as a spectator, but as an observer of the impossible bargain Rome struck with its gods. This is the story of the Vestal Virgins, a sisterhood elevated above all women, yet constantly bound by a single catastrophic responsibility, the maintenance of an eternal flame that symbolized the city's very existence. If the fire died, Rome believed it died with it. The Vestals were not mere priestesses. They were Rome's spiritual insurance policy. Consider the psychological burden placed upon 6 young women, chosen before puberty to carry the weight of an entire civilization. Their purity was synonymous with Rome's fortune, their vigilance the only barrier against cosmic collapse. Think for a moment. In a society defined by masculine power, why was this supreme authority, the power to ensure divine favor, given exclusively to women? It was a calculated risk, a masterful blend of superstition and statecraft. Rome needed its priestesses to be divine, because the alternative, that they were merely human, was too terrifying to contemplate. This pressure created an atmosphere of constant, suffocating tension within the temple walls. The initiation was not a calling, but a state-sponsored seizure, which the Romans, in a moment of chilling honesty, called captio. Imagine your life as a young girl playing innocently in a patrician home when the Pontifex Maximus, the city's chief religious authority, arrives at the door. He is accompanied by attendants and the silent gaze of the state. He does not ask for permission. He performs a ritual declaration. The Pontifex would take the girl's hand and declare, "I seize you, beloved, for the service of Vesta." That single phrase dissolved childhood, lineage, and future agency in one swift, terrifying moment. The girl was no longer a daughter of her father, but a daughter of the state, dedicated to 30 years of sacred, solitary duty. Following the seizure, the procession moved through the Forum, the crowds hushed, watching the spectacle with a mixture of reverence and relief that their own daughter had been spared. This public display of transition cemented the girl's new, untouchable status. Her innocence was now public property, tied inextricably to the well-being of the Republic. Upon entering the house of the Vestals, the final symbolic severance was performed. Her hair, the last physical connection to her previous life and family, was ritually cut off. This act symbolized the total abandonment of her secular existence, replacing it with the severe, pure identity of the goddess Vesta. She was removed entirely from the social support systems of her past, isolated in a new, cold world of marble and ritual. The House of the Vestals was a paradox, a sprawling, opulent estate located strategically next to the bustling Roman Forum. It featured lush courtyards, running fountains, private gardens, and elegant columns, a luxurious physical sanctuary. But observe the spatial details. While she could roam freely within the complex, she could not leave without official permission. Guards were not needed at the gates because the constant, unseen surveillance of the gods, the state, and the Roman populace was far more effective. It was a gilded cage of unparalleled refinement. The message resonated in every echo of her footsteps. You possess all comforts, save for freedom. You have all power, save for personal choice. Rounded for the newly consecrated Vestal, the reality of her duty quickly overshadowed the marble splendor. Her primary non-negotiable task was the maintenance of Vesta's eternal flame. This was not a symbolic hearth fire. It was the spiritual conduit of Rome. If it thrived, Rome thrived. If it wavered, Rome trembled. Imagine the weight of this responsibility. An 8-year-old, far from home, staring into a pit of embers and knowing that a moment of inattention, a sudden gust of wind, or a simple mistake could precipitate cosmic panic and political ruin. Before touching the sacred flame, the Vestal had to survive a decade of relentless training. This was an apprenticeship in precision, patience, and absolute control. She memorized hundreds of ritual chants, learned the specific procedures for preparing the mola salsa, and mastered the art of maintaining the fire using specialized wood and tools. The atmosphere was one of profound scrutiny. Senior Vestals and the Pontifex constantly observed her posture, her gaze, her slightest movements. A mispronunciation, an improper gesture, or a moment of visible distraction could be interpreted as a failure of purity, or worse, a negative omen for the state. Despite the fear, the Vestals enjoyed privileges unmatched by any other woman in Rome. They were legally independent, a revolutionary concept in a patriarchal society. They could own property, write wills, and move through the city without the mandatory oversight of a male guardian. Furthermore, they held the extraordinary power of pardon. If a condemned criminal, on the way to his tragic end, happened to touch a Vestal, even accidentally, he was instantly granted freedom. This was not merely a ceremonial rite. It was a potent reminder that the divine power vested in these women superseded even the authority of Rome's magistrates and legions. The second decade marked the Vestal's full service, the 10 years of peak pressure. No longer novices, they were now Rome's primary spiritual workforce, actively participating in public rituals, purification ceremonies, and guarding the city's most sacred and confidential state documents. Every public appearance was a performance of flawless dignity. They had to embody serene calm, even as they walked past the volatile crowds of the Forum. This was the era where success meant silence. No one noticed you if the empire remained stable, but failure meant a sudden, terrifying public spotlight. The greatest physical fear was always the fire. If the sacred flame went out, the disaster was instant and absolute. The Vestal responsible was not subjected to a public trial, but to a swift, humiliating purification. She would be taken to a darkened chamber and stripped. The Pontifex Maximus, or one of his subordinates, would administer a beating, often using whips made of leather. This punishment was described by Romans as gentle and necessary to cleanse the spiritual contamination. Yet to endure the sting of the lash while knowing you had endangered the entire city was a profound act of spiritual and psychological violence. More terrifying than the extinguished flame was the concept of violated dignity. The Vestal's vow of chastity was Rome's spiritual bedrock. For a Vestal to break this vow was not a personal scandal, but an act of treason against the gods, guaranteeing disaster for the Republic. Rome, which tolerated rampant infidelity among its male elite, obsessed over the immaculate purity of these 6 women. The rule was clear, the expectation merciless. They were expected to exist as walking symbols, devoid of human passion, emotion, or desire. Prominence of this purity was brutally efficient and often weaponized. A Vestal did not need to be guilty. She merely needed to be accused by a politically motivated rival, or implicated by bad omens, a failed harvest, an unfavorable flight of birds. Once the whisper of scandal began, the city entered a frenzy. Facts were irrelevant. The collective fear of collapse demanded a sacrificial lamb. This created an atmosphere of pervasive paranoia within the temple. Every private interaction, every fleeting glance was scrutinized, not by men, but by the relentless, cruel logic of superstition. When a Vestal was condemned, Rome employed its most dramatic and morally ambiguous punishment: burial alive. The state could not shed sacred blood, so a horrifying loophole was devised. The condemned woman was stripped of her robes, placed into a covered litter, and carried through the city in a grim, silent procession. She was then led to a small, purpose-built subterranean vault on the Campus Sceleratus, the field of wickedness. Inside the vault, the Vestal found a small bed, a lamp, and a meager ration of bread and water. The items were meant to maintain the pretense that Rome was not executing her, but merely allowing the goddess Vesta to reclaim her life. The Pontifex offered a final prayer: and the exit was sealed with dirt and stone, locking the woman into a cold, eternal darkness. It was a slow, agonizing end, driven by fear. The man implicated in the scandal, however, usually met a swifter, less theatrical death by flogging in the forum. The contrast in their tragic ends highlighted the gendered cruelty of Roman justice. If a Vestal survived the first 2 decades, 10 years of training and 10 years of full service, she entered her final phase, 10 years of teaching. This was the decade of mentorship, where she transitioned from the recipient of severe discipline to the dispenser of it. She taught the terrified young novices the intricacies of ritual, the language of the omens, and the paramount importance of stillness and emotional restraint. Having mastered fear, she now embodied authority. The senior Vestal was a figure of quiet, formidable power. She carried the collective wisdom of 30 years spent guarding the Empire's spiritual life. When she spoke to the new recruits, her warnings about the sacred fire or the perils of impurity were not academic. They were born from decades of high-stakes, real-world experience, often tinged with the memory of the living tombs she had seen sealed. Her task was to ensure the survival of the tradition, demanding a near-inhuman perfection from the next generation. After 30 years, the Vestal was finally free. She could, theoretically, return to the mortal world, marry, and live as an independent, wealthy woman. This was a form of supreme freedom unmatched by any other Roman matron. She had legal and financial autonomy, respected by all. However, 3 decades of isolation, surveillance, and conditioning had taken an enormous toll. Mechs, retired Vestals, struggled to adapt to life outside the temple. The idea of surrendering her hard-won independence to a husband often proved unappealing after ruling her own destiny for so long. Furthermore, having lived a life of ritual perfection, the chaos, spontaneity, and moral compromise of everyday Roman life must have seemed overwhelming. She was a woman who knew the precise ritual to avert a plague, suddenly faced with the mundane struggle of choosing a spouse or managing a noisy household. The Vestal Order endured for over 1,000 years, outlasting the Republic and witnessing the rise and fall of countless emperors. But as the Roman Empire transitioned, so did its spiritual identity. By the late 4th century CE, Christianity was ascending, and traditional pagan cults, including Vesta, lost political and financial support. The sacred, eternal nature of the flame began to look like an outdated relic of a fading world. The final, definitive blow came in 394 CE, when Emperor Theodosius I, determined to purge paganism, issued the decree that dissolved the order. The House of the Vestals, which had sheltered generations of fire-keepers, went silent. The sacred flame, which had endured wars, earthquakes, and political upheaval, was extinguished not by disaster, but by bureaucratic decree. The irony was profound. The Vestals were taught to fear catastrophe, scandal, or divine wrath. Yet the end came not with a bang, but with a simple, calculated end to their mandate. Rome did not collapse the moment the fire died. The earth did not shake. Life, frustratingly, continued. The Vestals who remained found themselves relics, revered symbols of an identity Rome no longer wished to claim. Today, the ruins of the House of the Vestals stand quiet in the Forum. The dry fountains and cracked statues testament to the fragile nature of power. The courtyard that once echoed with the footsteps of young priestesses now hosts silent tourists. Yet the atmosphere retains a density, a reminder of the immense, unforgiving psychological demands placed upon those women. Their story is a chilling study in state control and ritualized cruelty, disguised as honor. Their legacy is not one of flawless piety, but of profound, relentless endurance. For 1,000 years, they performed an impossible task, embodying the purest ideal of Roman stability. They demonstrated that supreme power and absolute vulnerability could coexist within the same human form. They were honored for what they gave up and destroyed for the slightest hint of humanity. This video is created for educational and historical purposes, flushing themes of power, corruption, and human conflict, withdrawing without depicting explicit or graphic events. Slashing that now reigns over the Temple of Vesta is heavy. carrying the echo of 30 years of whispered vows and extinguished hopes. We are left to reflect on the immense price Rome paid for its perceived stability, the sacrifice of 6 young lives dedicated to a flame. The history we unearth is rarely comfortable, often unsettling. If this made you question the past, you're welcome to continue the journey with us.